This story includes scenes that some viewers may find very disturbing, including violence, manipulation, and the murder of a minor. While the story has been fictionalized for storytelling purposes, the main events are based on a true crime case. Names, locations, and some details have been changed. Certain moments have been added to fill gaps and build emotional depth. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before her name started appearing in news reports, most people thought of Leona Hale as dependable and involved in the community. Around her neighborhood, she was seen as someone you could count on. She regularly attended parent-teacher school meetings, was active in her church, and became known for baking banana bread often. People thought of her as a dedicated mother. She partly homeschooled her son Jonas because of his special needs. Her daughter, Tara, was described by classmates as quiet and protective of her brother. Tara usually kept her phone with her, but she didn't post much online. From the outside, the Hale family looked fairly normal. They lived in Gilbert, Arizona. Leona stayed home with the kids, and her husband Michael worked in IT. On the weekends, he also volunteered as a coach for a soccer therapy group that Jonas took part in. The family often went on camping trips and visited relatives during the holidays. But according to people close to them, something began to shift. At first, it was gradual, but then the changes started happening more quickly. In early 2019, Michael began confiding in his sister about concerns he had regarding Leona. He said she had started talking a lot about something she called spiritual rankings. She believed people could be divided into light, possessed with good spirits, or dark, possessed with demons, and she claimed she could read people's souls. It began with strange talk that used parts of the Bible, but it developed into conversations about portals, energy shifts, and divine missions. Leona told Michael that God was communicating with her directly. Sometimes she heard God's voice, and other times the messages came to her in dreams. She said the world would be ending soon, and that only certain chosen people would survive. She believed she had been chosen by God to lead 144,000 pure souls who would rebuild life after a spiritual war. According to her, that war had already started, but most people couldn't recognize it. Michael, who was a very logical person, tried to remain patient, but what she was saying began to trouble him more and more. She told him their son, Jonas, who was just 7 at the time, was no longer their real child. She said a dark spirit had taken over his body. She said something similar about Tara, claiming that their daughter's original soul was gone and what remained was a threat to Leona's purpose. He tried to explain her behavior as a reaction to stress. She wasn't sleeping, and she had stopped taking her prescribed medication, saying she didn't need it anymore because God was healing her. Michael urged her to get help. He even reached out to her pastor, hoping someone from the church might be able to talk to her, but no one was able to help. Eventually, Michael called the police. He told them his wife had made concerning statements about the children and believed she was receiving instructions from God. She was taken in for a short-term mental health evaluation. But when she was assessed, she spoke in a calm and clear way. She said she was simply a religious woman and claimed that Michael had misrepresented her words. Since she didn't appear to be a danger to herself or others, the doctors let her go. Michael didn't know what else to do. He started locking their bedroom door at night. He also spent more time taking the kids out of the house and quietly began considering divorce. But what he didn't realize was that Leona had already been in touch with her brother, Aaron. She told Aaron that Michael was possessed. Aaron had served in the military as a Marine and had a history of legal trouble, but he was still very protective of his sister. Investigators later found text messages between the two of them. Aaron had written things like, Michael was an obstacle to her light and not truly alive. Then, on the morning of July 11th, 2019, Aaron showed up at the house without telling anyone ahead of time and attacked Michael. He later claimed that Michael had attacked him first with a baseball bat, but that part was never confirmed. Leona told the same story as Aaron, using almost the exact same words. Michael was shot twice in the chest and died inside the home. When police arrived, they found Aaron sitting calmly in the living room. He raised his hands and cooperated fully. Leona appeared composed and told the officers it was self-defense. There were no security cameras in the house. At the time of the shooting, the children had been upstairs watching cartoons. no one was taken into custody. Later that same day, neighbors noticed what looked like a casual gathering in Leona's backyard. There was music playing, folding chairs set up by the pool, and pizza boxes on the patio. The kids were in the water, wearing floaties, and Aaron was there too, keeping an eye on them. That night, Leona texted 3 of her friends to say that Michael had been abusive and that they were finally safe. None of those friends had ever seen Michael act violently, but Leona spoke with such certainty that even those who doubted her felt unsettled. She didn't attend Michael's memorial. She told his relatives that she was mourning in her own way. She also told them that Tara had been accepted early to a religious college in California and that Jonas had new therapy arrangements in Idaho. She said they were going to live near her spiritual group. 3 days after the shooting, Leona packed up and left Arizona with both children. She didn't tell anyone where they were going. Phone calls to her stopped being answered. She no longer replied to texts. By mid-August, Tara had disappeared from all social media. Jonas, who used to send regular voice messages to his grandmother, stopped reaching out altogether. When family members asked Leona what was going on, she gave vague answers like, "They're with friends," or "They're adjusting to the move," or "We're off the grid for a while." Some relatives tried to give her space at first, but others grew very concerned. Michael was dead, the children were silent, and Leona could only be contacted occasionally, usually through posts or messages in a private Facebook group that was focused on religious warnings and end times predictions. Toward the end of the summer in 2019, Leona Hale ended up in Idaho. Around that same time, a man named Caleb Brooks was starting to get noticed, though it wasn't in a public or widely known way. He wasn't a traditional preacher. He didn't speak at churches or write books that made it onto bestseller lists. Instead, he connected with people in more hidden spaces, through lesser-known podcasts, groups focused on survivalism, and small, hard-to-find corners of the internet. He had self-published a few fiction books that were all centered around old civilizations, spiritual battles, and the belief that Earth needed to be cleansed. But the people who followed him didn't treat these books like fiction. They saw them as real messages to take seriously. Caleb didn't hold sermons. He ran what he called energy workshops in places like lodges or even in people's yards. He said that angels gave him visions and that he could read people's auras. He claimed that most people were already taken over by dark spirits that still looked human, but weren't truly alive. When he spoke, he used a very flat, serious tone. He didn't express emotion, and he described people as either having light inside them or being completely overtaken by darkness. He believed these spirits could move from one body to another, take control of someone, or even be removed. Leona ended up going to one of his retreats in Boise. It was called Awaken to the End. She didn't say anything to the group and didn't introduce herself. She sat in the back, listened carefully, and took notes while Caleb talked about how certain people had been chosen to clear dark energy from the world. He spoke about how the line between life and death was thinner than people thought, and he described portals that connected different levels of reality. At that point, both Caleb and Leona were still married, though Leona's husband had just died. But after that retreat, they formed a close relationship very quickly. Within a week, Leona reached out to Caleb through a forum connected to the group. Investigators would later recover those messages. In them, it was clear they weren't just two people who believed the same things. They spoke like they were planning something together. Leona said she felt like she had known Caleb in other lifetimes. Caleb replied by saying he had recognized her as soon as she arrived at the retreat and that he believed she was Celestia, a spiritual warrior he had seen in his dreams. After that, the two of them stayed in frequent contact. They exchanged messages nearly every day. In these conversations, Leona said she believed her children had been overtaken by dark forces. Caleb told her this was something he had seen before. He advised her to fast, to pray, and to get her body ready for the role she had been chosen to play. Leona said that Tara had become just a shell of light that has been dimmed beyond repair, and she described Jonas as someone who had once been full of light but was now cloaked in decay. They started keeping shared documents where they organized their thoughts. One of these was a spreadsheet called the Z-List, short for zombies. That was the term they used to describe people who they believed were spiritually dead, but still alive physically. Tracy Brooks, who was Caleb's wife, was listed first on that spreadsheet. Tara and Jonas were also included. On October 19, 2019, Tracy Brooks died in her sleep. She was 48 years old. Caleb told people that she had a severe coughing that night and then collapsed. He also said that she had been feeling very tired recently. He didn't report any history of health problems. Since there were no signs of physical injury, and based on what Caleb told them, the coroner ruled that she had died of natural causes. No autopsy was done. Her body was embalmed and buried 3 days later. Just 2 weeks after that, Caleb and Leona got married. The wedding was held on the island of Kauai. Their marriage license was publicly available, and eventually photos came out showing the two of them smiling, wearing white robes, and standing barefoot near the ocean. 2 other followers attended the ceremony as witnesses. Caleb told his group in Idaho that Tracy had passed away peacefully, and that Celestia had entered his life at exactly the right moment. Most people in the group accepted what he said without question. Leona didn't tell anyone in her extended family that she had remarried. She also didn't say where her children were. She kept saying that Tara was enrolled in an early college preparation program. She said Jonas was living with a relative, though she never said who, and that he was receiving specialized therapy meant for kids with spiritual gifts. But her family started noticing that her stories didn't add up. Leona's sister became especially worried because she hadn't heard anything from Tara in quite a while. She tried contacting the school that Leona had mentioned, but there were no records of Tara ever being there. She also looked into the therapy center that Leona had talked about, but that place didn't exist. No one had seen Jonas on a video call since the summer. What made things even more concerning was the way Leona talked about her kids. She didn't show any emotion when people asked about them. When family members brought up birthdays, holidays, or even just wanting to speak to the children, she answered in ways that felt distant. She said things like, "They're evolving, they're on a journey of purification," or "We're not on the same frequency anymore." The family felt like these answers weren't just strange, they sounded rehearsed. In December 2019, Leona posted a video in a private Facebook group. She used her spiritual name in the video. She was smiling and spoke calmly with steady eyes and a flat tone. In the video, she talked about something she called graduations of light. She explained that some spirits leave Earth before others even begin their time here. She didn't mention her children directly, but the way she talked made people who watched it later feel uncomfortable. Eventually, one of her family members reported the children as missing in Arizona. That led to a formal welfare check. The case was sent to the Fremont County Sheriff's Office in Idaho, which began working with police in Hawaii, where Leona and Caleb had moved for a while. In January 2020, Leona was served with a court order requiring her to show that Tara and Jonas were alive and safe. They didn't just want a verbal claim, they needed actual proof, like recent photos, a video, or a phone call that could be verified. They told her that if she didn't do this, she could be charged with child endangerment or interfering with a police investigation. Leona did not respond to the request. She ignored the deadline completely. That refusal to show any proof that her children were alive turned the case into a serious criminal matter. She was arrested for obstruction. Her mugshot shows her smiling. When investigators questioned her, Leona said she didn't need to show any proof because, as she put it, their spirits had moved on. The investigators asked again where the children were physically, who had seen them last, and where they had been living. She didn't give any clear answers. When they asked Caleb, he told the police that he had never met the children. Back in Idaho, law enforcement searched Caleb's house, a storage unit connected to Leona, and nearby properties. In the storage unit, they found several boxes of the children's belongings. These included toys, clothes, and school items that hadn't been used for a long time. They also found Jonas's favorite shoes, a drawing he had made of his dog, and a pile of children's books with bookmarks still stuck in the middle of the pages. Inside the closet of the same storage unit, they came across a whiteboard. On it, there were 2 lists, one labeled light and the other dark. Tara and Jonas were listed under dark. Below Jonas's name, someone had written the words, "Obstruction complete." The search at Caleb Brooks's property began early in the morning, before daylight. Officers from several law enforcement agencies showed up quietly and wore plain clothes so that neighbors wouldn't notice anything unusual. They had a warrant that had been signed the night before, and it allowed them to search the entire property, not just the house. That included the backyard, which had recently been renovated. Caleb had always claimed he never met Leona's kids, but investigators had been finding things that suggested otherwise. Cell phone data showed that Leona's phone had been near Caleb's house many times just after she arrived in Idaho. They also got hold of a surveillance video from a nearby gas station. In the footage, Leona's car could be seen, and child booster seats were still in the back. The video also showed her pulling into a driveway that matched Caleb's address. This directly went against what Caleb had told police, that the children were never there. Because of that contradiction and the earlier discovery of a list labeling certain people as dark spirits, detectives turned their focus to the backyard. There were a few things about the yard that didn't look right. The landscaping looked rushed. Some areas had new sod that was laid unevenly. There was a raised garden bed that didn't seem to fit in, and a large circular fire pit where the ground around it was blackened and burned. At first glance, it might have seemed like an ordinary backyard, but the smell around the fire pit made officers suspicious. When cadaver dogs arrived, they headed straight for the garden bed. Within minutes, both dogs sat and began to whine, which is how they signal the presence of human remains. That area was marked, and investigators began carefully digging. What they found first was very disturbing. They uncovered plastic sheeting that had been tightly wrapped and sealed with heavy duct tape. As the sun began to rise, they opened it up and found the body of a child. It had been completely wrapped and placed in a way that showed the person who did it had tried to preserve and hide the body, not simply get rid of it. The child was wearing a charm bracelet. Later that day, forensic experts confirmed that the remains belonged to Jonas Hale. His body had been wrapped in 3 separate layers of plastic. Each layer had been sealed with tape at the ankles, around his torso, and at his neck. He was still dressed in his pajamas. Inside the tape, they also found a small dinosaur sticker. After taking a break to collect themselves, officers kept digging. A few feet away from where Jonas had been found, near the fire pit, they made another discovery. This one was even more disturbing. They found bones that had been burned and broken. These remains were buried deeper, and the body was not intact. It had clearly been set on fire intentionally, and the damage was extensive. The skull had been separated from the spine, and the hands were missing. Dental records later confirmed that these remains were Tara's. There were no clothes or jewelry found with Tara's remains. The only way to confirm her identity was through a few of her molars and 1 vertebra. The forensic teams determined that the fire had been maintained for a long time, probably using gasoline or lighter fluid. Most of Tara's body had turned to ash. The remaining pieces had been placed under heavy blocks and covered with dirt. Investigators believed the burial had not been rushed. It had been thought through and carefully carried out. While all of this was happening, Caleb Brooks was still inside the house. He stood by a window, watching the officers outside. At one point, he asked if he could go outside for a moment. Since he hadn't officially been detained yet, they allowed it. But once he saw officers pulling what looked like a black plastic bag out of the ground, he turned and quickly started walking toward his car. He didn't get far. 2 officers in plain clothes were already near the vehicle. They stopped him right as he reached the driver's side. They told him to put his hands behind his back. He tried to resist slightly and asked, "Is this really necessary?" But within seconds, they had him in handcuffs on the driveway. At that moment, Caleb was charged with 2 counts of obstruction and taken into custody. Investigators were still working on additional charges for murder. At the jail, detectives told Leona that the bodies of her children had been found. Her reaction wasn't what they expected. She didn't cry. She didn't ask where they were discovered or what had happened to them. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and closed her eyes. An officer in the room wrote in his report that she didn't seem sad. Instead, she looked like she was relieved. When she was asked again what had happened to the children, she simply said, "They're safe now. Their missions are complete." Police started to build a timeline. They found out that Leona had pulled Tara out of school 6 months earlier, saying she planned to homeschool her. After that, no new school records were filed. Jonas had also stopped going to his therapy sessions in Arizona about 3 weeks before the family left the state. His therapist had tried calling multiple times and even requested a welfare check. Leona responded by saying they were traveling to realign their spiritual grid. Some neighbors in Arizona said they remembered hearing screaming the night before the family moved, but no one contacted the police. Inside the storage unit, investigators found Leona's journals. In one entry, she wrote about a spiritual portal that could only be opened once the darkness is removed. Another entry described her children as barriers to the final mission and marked a specific date, October 22nd, next to the words, "Exit complete." That date was one day after Tracy Brooks, Caleb's wife, had died. Police also looked through Caleb's laptop. They found a draft of a book he had been writing but never released. The story followed a character named Celestia and described her journey to cleanse the earth of false spirits. One chapter, titled Final Seal, talked about a ritual that involved purification through flame and the burial of corrupted shells. From all of this, investigators concluded that what had happened wasn't sudden or emotional. It had been planned in advance. Caleb and Leona had used spiritual beliefs to justify what they did. They didn't just think they were chosen. They believed they had the right to carry it out. One detective reviewing Caleb's internet history found a particularly troubling search. Just days before Tara was killed, Caleb had looked up, "How long does a soul take to leave the body after death?" The prosecution spent a significant amount of time going through digital evidence they had collected from Leona's email accounts, cloud storage, and several devices found both at her home in Arizona and at Caleb's house in Idaho. Some of these files had been encrypted, and others were hidden inside folders that had religious-sounding names like Armor of Light and The Gathering. But when investigators looked at the contents, they found material that was far more troubling than they had expected. One file, which was dated a few weeks before Michael Hale died, contained a written note from Leona. In it, she said, "He has chosen darkness. I have cried, prayed, and pleaded, but it is done. His spirit is no longer his own. The portal will not open until his removal." They also found an audio recording Caleb had sent to Leona through a secure messaging app. He spoke in a calm voice and told her, "You have done the hardest thing. Do not weep. We must keep going. The children are already gone in spirit. You're just helping their bodies catch up." Investigators came across many messages like that. In Caleb's cloud archive, where he stored draft versions of his podcast, they found recordings that had never been shared publicly. In those recordings, he listed names including Michael Hale, Tracy Brooks, Tara, and Jonas. He described them using words like obstacles, dark agents, and empty vessels. One of those recordings was made only 2 days before Tracy died. In that one, Caleb said, "I have prayed for mercy. It did not come. Now we act." The case took a major turn when prosecutors managed to recover deleted messages between Leona and her brother, Aaron Hale. For a long time, Aaron had claimed that he shot Michael in self-defense, but these messages revealed something else. 2 days before the shooting, Leona texted Aaron saying, "You'll be protected. God will cover you. Once Michael is gone, we will be free to prepare. The children are next." Aaron replied with hesitation. He wrote, "I don't want to hurt the kids, Lee. This is your mission, not mine." Leona responded, "They are not the children you knew. Not anymore. The Lord has told me. Their spirits are not theirs." When the jury heard all of this, it became clear that this wasn't a case of someone acting in a moment of panic or confusion. The prosecutors showed that it was a belief system developed over time that was used to make murder seem acceptable. Each person who died had been labeled as dark, and prosecutors began referring to the list of victims as a spiritual kill list. Leona's defense team tried to argue that she was mentally unwell. They said her actions came from religious delusions and that she couldn't tell the difference between right and wrong. They brought in psychologists who testified that Leona showed signs of fixed delusions and grandiosity. But the prosecution responded with their own expert witnesses, who said that Leona understood her actions were wrong because she worked to cover them up. They pointed out how she hid the bodies, lied to the police, and made up stories about the children being away at college or with family. One of the prosecution's experts said it plainly while testifying. She wasn't out of her mind, the expert said. She was out of empathy. The court also heard from Caleb's adult children, who are now in their 20s. One of his daughters described how her father's beliefs had changed over time. He started talking about portals that would open on sacred land. He began claiming that certain people, mostly women, were inhabited. At one point, he even said their neighbor's dog was carrying the spirit of a Roman soldier. She explained that he had started doing rituals in their living room. He would kneel inside a circle he had drawn with chalk and speak quietly to what he called spirit guides. He stopped celebrating birthdays, saying the calendar was man-made and connected to darkness. He also burned their family photos. When she asked him why, he told her, "You wouldn't understand. This is not your life. Not yet." The topic of Leona's mental health also came up in court. A nurse from the county jail testified about some of the things Leona had said to her. Leona told the nurse she wasn't really a mother, but instead was an eternal goddess vessel. She said she was awaiting activation and that once the veil lifted, her new children would arrive. When the nurse asked her what that meant, Leona smiled and said, "The old world is over. You just don't know it yet." Then there was a new piece of evidence, something from Tara. In a kitchen drawer at Leona's Arizona house, investigators found an old tablet. On that device, they located a notes app that was password protected. Inside, there were several journal entries that Tara had written during the months leading up to her death. In those entries, she described changes in her mother's behavior. She said Leona had stopped hugging her and now only spoke to Jonas through prayer. Tara had also overheard her mother talking to Caleb on the phone at night. She wrote down one of the things she heard. "She's resisting again. I don't think she's ready." In another entry, Tara wrote, "I'm scared. If something happens to me, I didn't run away. I think she's going to hurt Jonas too." She had tried to ask for help. Investigators found unsent emails on the tablet. One was addressed to a youth pastor, but she hadn't finished it. One of the last entries said, "I don't think I'll be here next week. Please find Jonas if I'm gone." The medical examiner's report on Jonas was extremely upsetting. The findings showed clear signs that he had been smothered. There were small hemorrhages in his eyes, known as petechiae, and bruising around his mouth. His wrists and ankles had been tied. The plastic that was used to wrap his body had symbols drawn on it with a Sharpie. There were crosses, eyes, and circles. Later, investigators matched those drawings to ones found in Caleb's unpublished book. In court, the prosecution didn't try to add any extra emotion to what was already a disturbing case. They presented each piece of evidence slowly and thoroughly. Leona never looked at the photographs shown during the trial. When parts of Tara's journal entries were read aloud, she sat quietly and hummed a soft tune. Court officers later said she sang that same tune every morning before the trial began. She told them it was from a past life when she had been the mother of kings. As the trial neared its end and closing arguments approached, the jury had now seen everything. They had heard about the deaths, the delusions, the use of religion to justify violence, and the way the plan had been carefully set in motion long before anything happened. Now it was time for the jury to decide. And for the first time, Leona would have to listen as someone else claimed the authority to speak for God. When the verdict was finally delivered, Leona Hale was brought into the courtroom in chains. She was wearing a white prison uniform by then, not the floral dresses she used to wear when she spoke at church events. Her hair was uneven and had grown out while she'd been in jail. She didn't speak or smile. The courtroom was packed. People who had lost family members were there. So were people who had known Leona before, along with reporters and others who had been following the case closely. The jury came in quietly. A few of them looked at Leona. Some avoided looking at her at all. The jury foreperson stood and began reading the charges one by one. Leona was found guilty of first-degree murder for Tara Hale's death. She was also found guilty of first-degree murder for Jonas Hale's death. In addition to that, she was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. She was also convicted of grand theft because she had kept receiving benefits after she claimed the children had relocated. And finally, she was found guilty of child abuse that resulted in death. Each time a charge was read out loud, Leona blinked slowly but didn't show any reaction. After the fifth charge, she whispered something. The court officers later said they believed she had been praying. The sentencing didn't happen that same day. It took 3 more days, and those days were filled with testimony from people who were still alive and also from those who had left behind words before they died. Detective Maria Sanchez spoke during the sentencing phase. She had been one of the people who found Jonas's body, which had been buried close to Caleb's fire pit. She had worked many homicide cases before, but this one seemed to affect her in a different way. She got emotional as she described what she had seen. She said Jonas had been wrapped up like trash. He was still wearing small socks with dinosaurs on them. His wrists had tape marks and his arms were very thin. She said it was clear he had struggled and that it was the kind of thing you never forget. Tara's best friend Naomi also took the stand. Her hands were shaking as she opened a wrinkled piece of notebook paper. She said Tara had written something in her yearbook that had seemed odd at the time, but now it made sense. She read it out loud. "If I disappear, promise to tell someone I tried. I wanted to run. I wanted Jonas to be okay, but I don't think I'm strong enough. Don't forget me." When she read that, there were gasps in the courtroom. Leona didn't react. Michael Hale's sister also gave a statement. She talked about how it felt like her brother had died twice. Once when he was killed in his own home, and again when people didn't believe he had been trying to protect his children. She said he died thinking he had failed. Other people gave statements too. Some were neighbors who remembered things Leona had said in her final months. One woman began to cry while describing how she had seen Leona laughing by the pool on the same day her husband was killed. Leona's brother, Aaron Hale, didn't speak during sentencing because he had died in his sleep 3 weeks before any charges were officially filed against him. The coroner said it was a pulmonary embolism and ruled it a natural death. But some people didn't believe that. According to Aaron's partner, he had become paranoid and withdrawn after the children disappeared. He believed that Leona had put a curse on him. He had told people, "I'm next." When the judge finally gave Leona her sentence, he didn't give a long or emotional speech. He looked right at her and spoke in a calm, steady tone. He told her that she hadn't been acting in a state of delusion alone. He said she had made careful plans, manipulated others, and knew exactly what she was doing. He said she had used religion to justify acts of cruelty and had treated that cruelty as something sacred. But the court, he said, saw it as murder. Then he delivered the sentence. 2 life terms, one after the other, with no chance for parole. There would be no appeal, no possibility of release. Leona blinked once more, then she closed her eyes. After the sentencing, attention turned toward Caleb Brooks. His trial kept getting postponed. First, there were issues with the digital evidence. Then there was a problem with the jury selection process. But the prosecution made it clear that they would be seeking the death penalty. Caleb remained in county custody. He refused to talk to reporters or anyone else outside his legal team. Sometimes he sent long letters to people who still followed his old podcast. In those letters, he quoted scripture and talked about a great cleansing that he claimed was on the way. He never once mentioned Tara. He never spoke about Jonas or Tracy either. Leona's case eventually became part of a broader conversation about how religious extremism can intersect with criminal behavior. News shows, podcasts, and documentaries started analyzing it. People focused on how end-of-the-world beliefs had been used to rationalize violent acts that had clearly been premeditated. They talked about how mental health screenings had failed to catch warning signs. They also pointed out how communication breakdowns between different states had allowed the children's deaths to go unnoticed for far too long. Leona's Aunt Rachel, a quiet woman, decided to start a support group. She called it Sons and Daughters of Silence. It was meant to help families who had experienced religious violence. At first, the group met monthly in Arizona. Later, they held meetings in Idaho and Utah as well. They worked on advocating for changes in how religious delusions are assessed in psychiatric care. They also launched a hotline for teenagers who were afraid of spiritual abuse happening in their homes. At Jonas's school, staff planted a small maple tree on the playground in his memory. Every year on his birthday, teachers read a poem that talks about being kind and brave in quiet ways. Some of the children still leave toy dinosaurs under the tree. Caleb is still being held in a high-security prison near Boise. His legal team keeps filing motions, but most of them get denied. At his latest court appearance, he only said one thing: the veil is thinning. He looked straight ahead and spoke directly to the judge. They were never your children. Their spirits had already moved on. The judge didn't respond. No one else said anything either. The judgment had already been given. They said they had been chosen to lead people into a new world, but instead they turned on the ones who trusted them and left the world they were given a little darker than before.